Meantime, a different kind of political battle heating up in California after Democratic Representative Katie Porter announced that she now is going to run for the U.S. Senate.
California needs a warrior in Washington. That's exactly why I'm announcing my candidacy for the United States Senate in 2024.
The 49-year-old is running for the seat currently held by Dianne Feinstein. The only problem, Feinstein hasn't said if she will retire or run again. She told the San Francisco Chronicle Porter's announcement will not affect her decision whether to seek re-election. Feinstein is 89 years old and currently the oldest member of the Senate. The announcement stirring up debate again over how long one person should serve in Congress. An age limit for members of Congress was the subject of a recent article in Business Insider, a suggestion most members of Congress balk at. Instead, term limits and an overhaul of the seniority systems have been presented as alternatives.
Well, joining us now is James Chappel, an associate professor at Duke University. I'm a Carolina alum, but you're still very welcome here. Quoted in that very article, Chappel has done extensive research on aging, and also with us today, Micah Beckwith, who is the Indiana State Chair for U.S. Term Limits. Gentlemen, good morning to you both. Thanks so much for being here. James, let's face it, Congress is getting older. The average age in the House, 58. That's compared to 49 back in 83. The Senate, the average age over in the upper chamber is 64. That is 10 years older than just 4 decades ago. Where is the ideal, well, if there is such a thing, is there an ideal average age for both chambers? Because let's face it, it's going to come down to an argument we hear over and over again in politics. New blood versus experience. That's what it always is, with a little hint of ageism for those in a certain age bracket. So let's start with you. How do you see this latest discussion taking shape, and does it really go anywhere?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And, you know, I'm a historian, and so when you think about what should Congress look like in terms of age? Well, if you look historically, Americans have tended to believe, or at least have tended to vote for, Congresses that are quite a bit older than the average population. And, you know, since not long after the Civil War, we've had Congresses that average about 50 years old. And as you said, yeah, right, in the last half century, it's gotten older. But also at the same time, Americans have gotten older. So if you counterpose the data you just did to how old are Americans, you would see there's a way in which it's actually keeping Congress representative. And so, you know, in the last half century, the average age of Congress has gone up maybe 10 years or so, but the average age of Americans has also gone up 10 years or so. So it doesn't strike me as a surprise, and it also does not strike me as a kind of grave crisis that we have, that the average age of Congress is ascending.
Now, Micah, you advocate for not age limits, but term limits within Congress. Make your case. How would that work out?
Yeah, so with U.S. term limits, we are getting members of Congress to sign a pledge that they would support any term limit legislation that would cross the floor. And ours is 3 terms for the House and 2 terms for the Senate. So that's 6 years serving in the House and 12 years serving in the Senate. And we believe that this is just going to continue to allow fresh blood, new ideas to populate Congress. And this is a federal thing. I'm not necessarily sitting here advocating for state and local term limits, because you know your state and local reps. You can see them at ball games or see them at the grocery store. It's hard to get a hold of your U.S. senator and to see them at the local grocery store. And so switching out those members of Congress is going to really create just this idea of fresh ideas, but also protecting against this career politician mindset that our founders never intended the citizen legislature to be. They always wanted it to be a servant leader. It was more like a jury duty kind of job where you got picked by your community to go and represent your community in Washington. You only do it for a short time, then come back and pass the torch to someone else. And term limits will help ensure that that is the case.
Micah, just a quick follow-up here. Is there any appetite to make this a reality in Congress?
Well, there is amongst the American people. Polls upwards of 80% of Americans want term limits. Now, I'm a conservative, and I'll get into some battles with some of my leftist friends. But the one thing we can always agree on is term limits. So if we ever, it's a beautiful thing, and so I think the Americans want it. Now, I don't know if Congress is going to limit themselves. That's why we're advocating for an Article 5 convention, a constitutional convention, which is found in Article 5 of the Constitution, which if 2/3 of the states pass resolutions, we can call our own convention to amend the Constitution to say term limits are a must.
All right, James. Well, that's fascinating. I mean, polls do show most people support term limits, as you just heard, but Congress governing itself is never going to do that because it's job security and membership has its privileges. Okay, we all know that. So is there any reality to that actually happening? And also address the counterpoint, which the politicians say is, we do have term limits in this country. It's called elections. If they want me out, they'll vote me out next November. That's what they always say. So does this really go anywhere considering the political complexities that logistics it will require and just the ego of folks in Capitol Hill?
Yeah, I know what you mean. I think one important distinction here is that the issue of term limits is not really the same as the issue of age limits, and they don't necessarily even solve the same problem. You know, there's a first-term senator right now who's 75, and you know, even if you have term limits, he could be there until he's almost 90. And so they strike me as very different kinds of issues. And I think that there may or may not be appetite for a constitutional amendment about this. But one thing to understand from a historical perspective is that amendments don't happen that frequently, obviously. You know, there was an amendment about term limits for president, which obviously has not impacted the age profile of the presidency. But what I really think is that I think if we're going to have a discussion about age in politics, I think that talking about term limits and talking about restricting the impact or influence of older Americans is sort of the wrong one to have, because there is an issue for older Americans in political representation. But I don't think it's that they're overrepresented. I think that really issues that impact older Americans, like saving Social Security, for instance, actually have a pretty small profile in politics. And so I think that anything we might do that would actually try to diminish the impact or the salience of old age issues, I think is the wrong step.
And plus, from a PR perspective, you can't talk about age limits anymore. It would have to, even if that's your goal, for whatever reason, not wrong or right, you have to put it under the guise of term limits, because then you're stepping onto criticism that you're being ageist or what have you. Yeah.
Right. James,
and rightly so, right?
Right, of course.
Because
Yes.
Yeah, because you know the whole idea about sort of new blood. I'm not sure term limits would do that. I mean, this person who was just elected to Senate from Vermont has been in politics for decades. He just never held the role of senator before. So it's not obvious to me that term limits would do what it sets out to do.
Mike, I want to give you a chance to respond to all this.
Yeah, well, I agree with James to an extent. I don't necessarily think age restrictions is the way to go, because you know I want competency over. Someone can be old and they can be very competent, and so that's really what we should be looking for as the American people. But to the kind of the shot of new blood, I think you have to understand that the power of the incumbency is very, very strong. 90% of incumbents win re-election. And so, yes, somebody could move from the House to the Senate or the Senate to the House. But when you give up the power of the incumbency, you're essentially giving the average Joe a little bit of a shot. Right now, it's so hard for the average American to run for the U.S. House or the U.S. Senate. You have to be wealthy, or you have to have great influence somewhere else. But we want average people to be able to step up and go serve, because that's really the heart of America, as we are that citizen legislature. So, yes, it doesn't necessarily, term limits don't, it's not the silver bullet, but I do think it is a very good step in the right direction.
But listen, a constitutional amendment is a heavy political lift at a time when people say, you know what, yeah, I support term limits, but this inflation and I don't know where this war's going, and then we got a presidential election around the corner, and I don't see it emerging through all of the other noise right now to become something that either the governor, the Senate, the people of the state put on the front burner right now. So it's a fun conversation, but do we get to a point where things actually begin to happen, or we just kind of have the standard debate and move on, and let's address it again in 4 years when nothing's changed again either?
Well, I think we can. I mean, I think that these are unprecedented times that we're living in, And we've never had a constitutional convention before. But again, only 2/3 of the country have to pass resolutions. If you'd like to see this happen and you're watching this right now, go to your state legislative representatives and say, pass a resolution in our state to support this constitutional amendment. And, you know, we had a constitutional amendment back in 1992. That's the most recent amendment to the Constitution, and it can be done again. It is a heavy lift, and that's a good thing. I mean, we don't want it to be easy to change, and because it makes sure that we don't change it into something that's terrible for the country. But I do think it's possible, but we've got to pick up the mantle and walk in that as Americans. If we want to see change, we've got to be the change.
James, 30 seconds, final thoughts.
I think that I don't really have strong views about term limits one way or another, but I do think that if a conversation about term limits is a proxy for diminishing the salience of old age issues in politics, I think that's the wrong way to think about it. So I think that, you know, there is this conversation about Feinstein and Biden and all these people about, the gerontocracy and things like that. And I think that conversation is distracting us from a much more productive conversation about aging in America, which is creating sort of intergenerational solidarity. Saving Social Security is good for all of us. It's good for us, those of us who have parents. It's good for, we all hope to get old one day. And so I think that insofar as these conversations kind of play into these ageist stereotypes about gerontocrats and things like that, I think it's the wrong conversation to be having.
All right. Micah said, be the change. Love it when a conservative borrows some Obama language. That did not go unnoticed there. And Duke University Associate Professor James Chappel from that other school, North Carolina.
So much shade.
So much shade. Hey, come on. Greatest rivalry in sports. Got to play it up. And Micah Beckwith, Indiana State Chair for U.S. Term Limits. Always a fascinating discussion. We'll see where the ball goes. But, gentlemen, thanks for illuminating us this morning. Appreciate it.